Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well, and I hope you're going to go and spoil yourself and get yourself that lovely, lovely hot cup of cocoa, something that will just glide down your throat like silk, because you deserve something special. So before we get started, remember this is the second part of the story, so if you haven't heard the first part of it, go back to it, click on the description, because you don't want to miss out on the whole story. So this is part 2. Bobby awoke with a start. His mother had just nudged him in the shoulders. "Get up, Bobby. We're here. Will you help your brother bring the luggage in from the trunk? I'm going to help get your dad from the wheelchair into the cabin. He needs to be tucked up into bed at once. It's been a long journey for him." "Sure," says Bobby, when he heard his mother's voice. He had been startled out of his sleep and was momentarily disorientated. Then he remembered where he was. They had arrived at the cabin. The lights of the taxi and the ethereal slivers of moonlight cast soft shadows over a glorious-looking Swiss-style cabin, with a cosy wraparound porch. Bobby climbed out of the truck, greeted by the icy blizzards of cold air that nipped against his neck, so he tightened his scarf around himself, put on his windbreaker, and pulled on his leather gloves. The snow was a couple of inches deep, and it had dappled the roof of the cabin, so it looked like a gingerbread house in the snow. Very quaint, very twee. The taxi driver helped their mother unload their father and their luggage, and wished them a Merry Christmas. "If you need anything, Mrs. Paxman, I'm not far from you at all. I can come at once. So if you have any problems with that husband of yours, I'd like to help if I may." "That's very kind of you, Mr. Tucker. It's a pleasure to meet you. Thank you for delivering us so safely to the cabin. You're an exemplary driver. Some of those conditions on the roads were hazardous. I wouldn't have liked to have been driving in them myself." "It's only a pleasure, Mrs. Paxman. May I take this opportunity to wish you and your family a very happy Christmas." He pauses for a moment. "I hope that your husband will be feeling a lot better in the morning." "Thank you. That's so kind of you. And please do send my regards to your family. Wish them the very best for the Christmas season. And happy holidays as well." "Will do so, Mrs. Paxman." What a nice man, she thought. The cabin was in darkness when they entered. Bobby's mother only put a few lamps on around it. From what Bobby could see, it was luxurious. The boys did not need to be persuaded to go to sleep. They were dropping with exhaustion after a long day of being fraught with worry, anticipation, hope, and all kinds of messed-up thoughts in between. So Bobby did not engage any hesitancy. When he found his way to the bedroom, which he was to share with his brother, his tired little body slipped behind Egyptian cotton sheets covered with a warm duvet and some light blankets. Soon he was caught up in the illusory, fantastical world of dreams. Dreams he was unlikely to ever remember, as he barely ever recalled any of them. When Bobby woke up the following morning, he sat up for a brief second, slipped his little feet into his fleece-lined slippers, and trotted over to the cabin window of his bedroom, peeking through a little gap that he'd made in the drawn curtains. He gasped in delight. He could see the world was swathed in white. He purred like an appreciative Cheshire cat, whose owner has given him a double portion of cream. It was transfixing out there. The Adirondack Mountains climbed up into the sky, like a sculptural staircase, with a magisterial repose and an ascending grace. The sprawling pine trees, bedecked with white Christmas baubles, made from the malleable hands of nature herself, were designed to mark this indelible occasion. They glistened and twinkled under the soft ethereal light, with a celebratory festive swagger, washing everything in an enchanting illumination that was reminiscent of a fairy tale. Bobby could smell the delicious savoury scents of Christmas permeate the cabin, seeping under the door of the bedroom. He could hear the bell-like trinkles of Christmas carols being played in the background on some kind of musical system. Bobby ran over to his brother, shaking the crumpled heap that resembled an inverted comma in the bed. "Wake up! It's Christmas, bro!" His dazed brother twitched for a moment and stared at Bobby through wide, earnest eyes. "I dreamt Daddy was spending Christmas with us. Please don't tell me it's a dream." "It's not," said Bobby, grinning from ear to ear. "Don't you remember we picked Daddy up from the hospital yesterday? He's here with us. Don't tell me you've forgotten already." Bobby watched his brother's face light up into a bright, jubilant smile. "Daddy's here with us," he said happily. "Yes, he is." The two boys hurriedly dressed into their jeans and sweatshirts and dashed into the kitchen, like two unbridled puppy dogs with a hyped-up, spirited energy. Their mother was bustling away contentedly, rather industriously, in the small state-of-the-art kitchen, singing joyfully to herself what sounded to be the Christmas carol Silent Night. She had clearly been working hard. She had parboiled the fluffy potatoes that were now sitting in the piping hot fat. She opened the oven to bring out the crisp golden turkey, covered in streaky bacon, that had been cooking for over 3 hours already. She was basting it with the fat. She looked up at the two boys when they entered the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, and rushing over to them, throwing her arms around them enthusiastically. "Happy, happy Christmas, sweethearts! Isn't it wonderful? Look how white it is out there! This is going to be such a magical Christmas! Happy Christmas, Mummy! I think it's going to be a very special Christmas for the four of us, don't you?" After Mrs. Paxman had given her sons a Danish pastry each and some hot chocolate for breakfast, she said, "How about you boys go outside now? It's so beautiful out there, with everything carpeted in snow. You could go tobogganing or exploring. I'll get the food ready for lunch and the fire going in the hearth. When you come in before lunchtime, we'll open your presents in front of your father. We're going to make this one hell of a special Christmas, one we won't forget in a hurry," she said, staring at them through misty eyes that threatened to cry. Mrs. Paxman had seen how sickly her husband was. When she had tucked him into bed last night, he was in a bad way. For a moment she almost regretted bringing him to the cabin. Maybe it hadn't been the wisest idea after all. What if his condition worsened? Mrs. Paxman had slept restlessly on Christmas Eve, as a tormenting thought badgered her heart with a nagging whisper. Last Christmas for your husband." "Stop it!" she screamed back in her mind. "Stop it! It's not true!" Mrs. Paxman in the end had decided to get up really early to distract herself with the preparation of the Christmas meal. She smiled warmly at her kids, trying her best to look positive and upbeat. She was determined to make this a memorable Christmas come what may. She refused to allow a defeatist attitude to rob the day of its joy. "Go on, will you?" she said to her children, smiling brightly. "Out into the snow. Make sure you're wearing your scarves, gloves, and your woolly hats. You don't want to get cold, do you?" Bobby didn't need any encouragement to go exploring, nor did his brother Paul for that matter. He paused for a brief moment to say, "How is Dad? Should we not go to see him to wish him Happy Christmas?" "No, not now, sweetheart. Let him rest a little more, will you? He's tired after the trip yesterday, and I've given him some pain meds. But I promise you by lunchtime he'd love to watch you open your stockings and presents, but leave him be for the moment." Before long, Bobby and his brother were walking across the snow, where several inches had fallen overnight. It was luxuriously thick, absolutely perfect. Their boots left a long trail of deep indentations in the serene white oasis. They ambled inquisitively towards the sprawling woodgrove that seemed to know it was Christmas. The trees stood lofty, proud and tall, their needled boughs adorned in white pearly wedding gowns. They were like a plethora of brides gathered together in a large congregation on their wedding day, Bobby couldn't help but think. "Happy Christmas, bro," said Bobby to his brother. "I don't think I actually said Happy Christmas properly to you." "Happy Christmas," said his brother, giving him a cheesy grin. "This place is amazing. The cabin is so magical, like something out of a fairy tale." Bobby had agreed. He'd never appreciated a cabin could be as lovely as this. Laughing and giggling, the two young boys chased each other ebulliently through the snow, throwing snowballs without restraint. The signature of their boots was written over every white patch of snow, but would likely soon be expunged by the snow that was predicted to fall later, extinguishing any signs that they had been there at all. The boys had unintentionally scared off a couple of deer that were scampering away, But then they stopped, stood very still, watching the boys from a distance, their looks a curious inquiry. "I wish we had some apples for them. They must be so hungry. How hard it is to eat food covered in snow. The food is probably frozen up. It's like they have to eat popsicles in the cold. Pine-flavoured popsicles, I imagine." "I think we do have some apples," said Bobby. "I saw a huge box in the store cupboard there. We can throw some out under the trees for them to eat. I just feel sorry for them, stuck out in the cold. It's got to be really tough." Bobby agreed. "I tell you what, when we get back to the cabin, we'll definitely do that. We'll throw some apples out for them." The two boys decided to build a snowman with stones for eyes, a twig for a nose, and some tiny pebbles for a wide mouth. It would have been so much better to have a carrot for the nose, Bobby had thought. But he didn't want to go back to the cabin to interrupt his mother's cooking. She was so focused on the job in hand, making an incredible spread for them, and there was nothing worse for a cook than to be rudely interrupted. Things could burn and go awry, with inconvenient distractions. The morning seemed to go by fast, and when they entered the woodgrove, Bobby stopped short in his tracks. He had the strong impression that something was watching them. He was almost certain he'd seen a head peering at him from behind a tree. He looked at his brother, who didn't seem to have picked up on the rather unsettling, bewildering vibe. "Something is watching us," Bobby whispered to himself. "I'm sure of it." In the distance he could hear cheerful laughter, shrill cries and screams. He saw some teenagers running around in the snow, outside another cabin, throwing snowballs at each other, shrieking and screaming loudly. He counted 5 of them, 2 boys and 3 girls, between the ages of 18 and 20. Thank goodness their cabin was well away from theirs, he thought. They were annoyingly loud. The 2 boys turned around to make their way back to the cabin, when Bobby's eyes were caught by some reflectant twinkling light. Then he saw it, dangling from the bough of a tree. But what was it? "What is this?" he said, reaching out to untie it and taking it down to examine it. It was like nothing he'd ever seen before. It was a necklace of some kind, with a leather thong, covered in carved leaves. The carvings had been made from animal bones, and in between the leaves were 3 prominent eagle feathers. The necklace looked like an ancient Indian indigenous piece of jewellery or artefact that a great Indian chief might have worn around their neck as a lucky amulet. "It's magnificent," said Bobby, examining the leaves more carefully. "Someone has carved these so beautifully. Finders keepers," he said proudly. They both examined the necklace, wondering what it could mean. It looked symbolic. When you touched it, Bobby described it as surprisingly warm, which was exceedingly weird, as it was freezing out there, with a biting wind whisking through the trees, burning their cheeks with its frosty kisses. Bobby had decided he'd wrap up this interesting amulet, giving it to his father for Christmas. It was so much more exciting as a gift than the colourful reindeer Christmas socks he'd brought his dad with the pocket money he'd saved. When the children arrived back at the cabin, the delicious savoury smells of turkey, glazed ham and bacon wafted in the air, as well as the fruity smells of cranberry sauce and apple and cinnamon. Bobby's stomach growled hungrily when the smells permeated his nostrils. There was an exquisite crackling fire in the hearth, where the flames crackled and popped. To the left-hand side of the fireplace was a huge Christmas tree that was covered in bright flashing twinkling lights, colourful wooden ornaments, silver and gold baubles, red bows, and a bright golden shiny star twinkled at the top of the tree. Their father sat on an upholstered chair by the fire, with a glass of eggnog in his hands, managing a smile for his children, but he looked washed out, peaky, pale and very sickly. Bobby noticed his father's eyes were like sunken hollows, his cheeks gaunt, his skin seemed almost tight over his skull. "Happy, happy Christmas, kids," he said. "What are you waiting for? Go on, open up your Christmas presents and stockings," he said, smiling at them cheekily. Bobby and his brothers pulled the stockings, brimming over with presents from the mantel, with a zealous enthusiasm. As usual, there was an orange parked in the toe, but their stockings were filled with all kinds of delights, from chocolates to toy vintage cars, blowing bubbles, notebooks, marbles, magic tricks, and playing cards. The kids then gravitated towards their main presents, shredding everything apart with delight, so that the floor was ultimately lined with Christmas wrapper. But the most exciting moment of all for Bobby was when his father opened the present that he had for him, that he'd found in the woodgrove only moments before, which he'd wrapped up at the very last minute. "Daddy, are you going to open it?" "This looks very intriguing," said his father, shaking the package. This was something the family always did before they opened a present. It was customary to try and guess what was inside. "Well, what is it, Daddy?" asked Bobby. "Guess. I bet you won't ever get it in 1,000,000 years.
"It feels like something hard and flat. I'm not sure what it could be, Bobby. I am flummoxed."
"I'm not saying anything," said Bobby stoutly, as he watched his father tear open the package, his hand so thin you could see every vein.
"Where did you get this, Bobby?"
asked his father, staring in awe at the carved leaves of the necklace and the feathers.
"It looks like these leaves are made from animal bones. They've been carved, but whoever has carved them has done a masterful job. This is very, very stunning. It looks like something an Indian warrior might have worn. I really like it, Bobby. I really do. It's the most unusual present I've ever received. Thank you very much."
Bobby did not want to tell his father he'd found it in the woodgrove, but was delighted when his father put on the necklace.
"I'm going to wear it, Bobby, all through Christmas. I don't want to ever take it off."
When Bobby was to reflect back on that Christmas, everything changed after his father put on that necklace. Within 20 minutes, Bobby's father was claiming he was ravenously hungry. The family was astonished when he bolted down 2 large plates of Christmas dinner. Their father had lost his appetite in hospital, but now he was stuffing his food down like a half-starved dog, or like those young men in hot dog eating contests when they cram their mouths full of food. Mrs. Paxman was nonplussed. She looked at her husband with eyes as wide as saucers, and a mouth so loose on her you could have been forgiven for thinking that it would fall off its hinges like a loose straw and come crashing down to the ground. Stranger still, their father was cracking jokes as if it was nobody's business, while they pulled their Christmas crackers. He roared with laughter and seemed to find everything hilariously funny. His laughter was so infectious and so contagious that everybody was laughing, not really knowing why they were laughing so much. It was like the energy their father had lost over the last few weeks had come rushing back like an obstreperous waterfall, blasting over the rocks without restraint. Bobby overheard his mother talking on her cell phone to her sister Megan. "No, I promise you it's absolutely true, Megan. It's like I've got my husband back. I don't understand what's going on. He hasn't complained of any pain whatsoever. He's cracking jokes all the time, eating like a horse. And we went for a walk in the woodgrove. He could not walk yesterday. He was so weak. He had to go to the car in a wheelchair. He's now bouncing around the house like Tigger in the wind of the willows. And I'm not joking either. If you ask me, Erica, your husband needed this Christmas break, and being with the family has made him well again." When Erica Paxman got off the phone, her brow creased with furrows that any beautician would have insisted needed to be ironed out with plenty of Botox. What had happened to her husband, she wondered. He was so much like his old self again. Then her heart sank when she remembered an old friend of hers, who was a nurse, telling her that people can make almost a miraculous recovery before they die. "It's called the golden hour," she had told her. Mrs. Paxman grimaced. Is that why her husband was so well? Was he dying, she wondered? Mrs. Paxman's husband told her he was feeling so much better.
"I haven't felt so good in such a long time. I don't remember the last time I felt this good. I don't need any pain meds. I've got my appetite back. And I think we should go for another walk. I'm champing at the bit to go out."
She could see colour in his cheeks, a sparkle in his eyes, an energy in him that hadn't existed 12 hours ago. This was like a Christmas miracle. Please God, may his good health continue, she told herself, closing her eyes in a silent prayer. She couldn't conceive a life without her husband, but over the last few weeks it had seemed that she was likely to lose the man she loved. The doctors had not skirted around the sobering truth or been evasive, but they had definitely avoided looking her straight in the eye. They had told her that while her husband was dangerously ill, very sick, they simply could not diagnose his condition, and had no idea what was causing the gradual decline in his health. They believed that if he continued on his grim path, that he was unlikely to survive past 6 months. This was something she'd never ever shared with her 2 sons, whom adored their father. How could she tell them something monumental like this, when they were hanging on to the life raft of hope, believing that he would recover? But deep down in her heart, Erica doubted that he ever would. She also knew, although she had never discussed the poor state of her husband's health with her children, they unequivocally knew that their father was dying. Her kids were exceedingly bright. You couldn't pull the wool over their eyes. This was why at the hospital, the normally demure woman, who never offended people with her guarded words, had spoken her mind to that pompous doctor, whom was always persuading her that the very best place for her husband was the hospital. She had walked into that hospital, following the script in her head. She was determined that even if this was their last Christmas, their father was going to spend it with his family. Come hell or high water, he was going to be discharged. Of course, the doctors had tried to sow doubt in her mind, and that was expected, like the ugly stitches on a pair of newly darned socks.
But are you sure this is wise, Mrs. Paxman? Here at the hospital your husband can be carefully monitored, his pain managed.
I believe, Doctor, that my husband needs a break from this inauspicious place, some quality time to spend with his children. You yourself say you don't know how much time he's got left. He deserves to spend Christmas with his family. To her amazement, the doctor had relented and agreed that sometimes it did patients good to have a break from the hospital. Mrs. Erica Paxman did not believe her husband was dying any more. No way! Something magical had happened in this cabin. She could not put a finger on it, but she knew she was staring at a miracle. Bobby went to bed feeling on top of the world that night. He knew his father was better. There was no doubt about that in his mind. He didn't understand how it had happened, but he knew in his gut that his father was not going to die. He promptly decided that this was quite literally the best Christmas he'd ever had. He lay there in his bed, staring up at the wooden ceiling, listening to the sound of the wailing wind outside, when his brother interrupted his chain of thoughts. "Bobby, are you awake?" he whispered. "Yes, I am. I couldn't get to sleep. I've been thinking, you see." "Me too," came his reply. "Daddy is better, isn't he, Bobby? Something strange happened today. I once heard in church that miracles can happen around Christmas time. Maybe God performed a miracle on Daddy. I've been praying, you know, an awful lot since he got sick." "I know Daddy is better," Bobby told his brother. "He had 2 helpings of Christmas pudding today. 2 helpings, can you believe it? I can't even eat that much Christmas pudding. I would get so sick if I ate that much. He ate more Christmas turkey and ham than me, and I've never seen him pig out so much. Mum tried to stop him. She told him he had to stop eating so much, that his stomach had shrunk, but he wouldn't listen. He kept saying, 'Leave me be. I'm really hungry.'" It was later that night that the Paxman family is woken to the sounds of something beating their cabin really loudly. It didn't sound like the punnelling wind or the blizzard that was whipping across the landscape at all. This sounded like something very big was beating their cabin like a drum. Could it be a bear, Bobby wondered? Of course not. They were in hibernation, he reminded himself. Bobby, now naturally very curious, hurriedly climbed out of his bed, slipping his cold feet into his fleece-lined slippers, wrapping his tartan dressing gown snugly around him, tying the belt around the waist in a sailor's knot. He trotted over to the window to look out between the crack in the curtain. At first he was greeted to the dark blanket of night that wore its velvety cloak quite proudly, but the soft whispers of moonlight stole some of the blackness away, so that parts of the night were swathed in a silvery glaze. Bobby can hear his father's booming voice, that over the last few weeks had become as soft as a church mouse. "What's going on out there?
Something's out there.
Bobby's mother's voice sounded panicky. I'm scared. I'm really scared. What's going on? Who's banging our cabin like this? Both Bobby's parents seemed rather troubled. Bobby looks out of the window. He suddenly sees these dark, big silhouettes, 3 of them. They're standing several feet away from the cabin and appear to be engaged in earnest conversation. Their pyramid-shaped heads seem to be nodding in agreement. They cast troubled eyes in the direction of the cabin. The mysterious creatures were standing on the edge of the woodgrove, with long timber beams in their hands, which Bobby suspected they'd been using moments before to bang the eaves of the cabin. They had stopped for a minute's reprieve or a wool-gathering session. Even watching them from the bedroom, bathed in the obscurity of the moonlight, they appeared to be not at all aggressive in their demeanour. So why are they banging the cabin like this? What do they want? Bobby is convinced these mysterious cryptid creatures must be Bigfoot, but they're far too indeterminate to see clearly, owing to the selective lighting of the moon and the dingy twilight. They're huge and bulky, with humanoid physiques, covered in long flowing dark hair, which is so dark that the silhouettes of the trees are equally as dark as they are. Coal, that's the colour he suspects they are. They're either black as coal or a very dark brown, Bobby decides. The creatures glide towards the cabin again, and the banging starts all over, causing everyone in the cabin to become exceedingly alarmed.
Something's out there, says Mrs. Paxman. I'll be damned if I go out and face whatever it is. Well, maybe I should go out and see what it is. No, you can't possibly do that. I'll call for help.
Mrs. Paxman tries to phone for some kind of help, but she can't get a signal on her cell phone. It had been working perfectly yesterday when she'd phoned her sister. They could hear the crashing sounds of rocks and timber beating against the cabin, followed by grunts and howls. Then everything stops, and whatever had been harassing them just disappears and goes away, and peace is once again restored in the household. The family is quick to forget about their former angst. The mind can be remarkably resilient when the need arises. Let's just say the marvellous recovery of Mr. Paxman's health had stolen the limelight of their focus, and the banging seemed to pale into the shadows of obscurity and be long since forgotten about.
I think it was 3 Bigfoot banging at the cabin,
Bobby told his mother.
They were beating our cabin with timber sticks.
Erica Paxman rubs her son's hair affectionately. I don't think it was Bigfoot, darling, she said. You've got a fertile imagination, little Bobby. Do you know what I think? Me and your father have uncovered what is actually going on. I happen to know from Mrs. Wensleydale that one of the larger cabins around here, very close to ours as it happens, has been rented out by a mother with 5 spirited teenagers. My bet is they're trying to scare us silly, as they have nothing better to do, probably bored out of their skulls. Teenagers can do nonsensical things at times, so it's nothing to worry about at all. The best thing to do is to ignore it. Your father is in agreement that this is what is going on. Bobby knew better than to argue with his mother, but he was in no doubt what he'd seen. He knew the banging on the eaves of the cabin had not been from teenagers. On Boxing Day things were so good, especially with Mr. Paxman eating so well. He looked incredibly healthy. It was hard to believe he'd been sick at all. They had all donned their snowshoes and gone exploring in the white countryside together as a family, but Bobby could not shake the ominous feeling that they were being watched and even stalked. I hope those teenagers don't come back tonight to bang at the cabin again. It's so annoying, says Mrs. Paxman, putting her children to bed, giving them both a kiss. But if they do, I don't want either of you to worry. Just ignore them. We saw those teenagers on Christmas Day, early in the morning, didn't we, Bobby? Yes, we did. They were throwing snowballs together and shrieking. Their cabin is the closest one to ours. Well, don't you worry about them at all, if they get up to their old tricks, said Mrs. Paxman. The best thing, as I keep telling you over and over again, is to ignore them. Then they'll go away. They want attention. They want us to be scared out of our skins. That's the entire idea of this game. So they will get bored like they did last night. I don't think when I was a teenager I would have drawn pleasure by scaring someone else half to death. But the both of you take no notice, if they do come back, and that's a big if.
Daddy's going to be better, isn't he, Mummy?
Bobby asked his mother. She sat on the edge of the bed and smiled. You know what, Bobby? Your father is a different man. I've almost forgotten he's sick at all. Do you know he ate 4 Danish pastries at breakfast? He had a 3rd helping of my turkey pie at lunch. And I was worried about it. You know, in the Holocaust, after those starved people were fed again, they had to feed them a tiny little bit at a time. If they ate large amounts of food, it would have killed them on the spot. That's why I was worried about your father eating so much. But he seems not to be having any trouble at all eating all that food. The mind boggles. You'd think his stomach would have naturally shrunk. You know those people who have bariatric surgery to make their stomach shrink to the size of a fist, so they're forced to eat tiny amounts of food so that they lose lots of weight? Well, the stomach naturally does that when you're starving. So how does your father fit all that food into his stomach? God only knows. He got on the scale this morning. He's put on 2.5 pounds. Nobody puts on weight that quick if they're sick. Yes, Bobby, to answer your question, I believe emphatically that your father is better.
Did you hear that, bro? Said Bobby, sighing happily. Mum thinks Dad is definitely better. That's the best Christmas present of all. It sure is. I couldn't have asked for a better one myself.
Bobby drifted off to sleep, in a trice like a fly caught up in a silken spidery web. He finds himself caught up in the throes of a deep, very lucid dream, the likes that he's never experienced before. He's standing in the wood grove. The trees are whispering his name. Bobby, Bobby, Bobby.
I'm here, he says. I'm here.
The forest is covered in a vaporous white mist, and in this mist he sees 3 figures standing behind it. The tallest of these ambiguous figures pulls back the foggy, vaporous curtain of mist and steps forward to reveal himself to Bobby. The Herculean-sized figure is a Bigfoot. He's looking at Bobby directly with pleading eyes. He extends out his large hands with fingers as big as sausages. "Give it back, Bobby," he says. "It's not yours to keep." The figure then turns around and glides away. Bobby wakes up with a start. Sweat is trickling down his face. The dream was so vivid, so real. The Bigfoot had appeared to him in the dream, asked him to give it back. Give what back? He wondered. It was a dream, he thought. I'm being so silly. The way those Bigfoots had walked through the mist, the dream felt as if they had come to him from another world. But never in his life had Bobby experienced such a tangible dream. He had even been able to smell the pine of the wood grove. How was that possible? Then he hears it, the banging on the eaves of the cabin. It's the Bigfoots, he thinks to himself. They were speaking to me in the dream. It was real. They want something from me, but what? He can hear his mother's voice trailing down the passage. It's those teenagers, playing games. Ignore them. Bobby barely hears his mother's voice, as the feeling that the Bigfoots want something from him just becomes all-consuming. And then a picture of the necklace he found in the wood with the carved leaves and eagle's feathers comes into his mind with an illumination that leaves him in no doubt. The banging of the outside cabin stops. A voice comes into his head that Bobby would describe later as like the voice of God. "We are waiting for you. Bring it to us. We want it back. It is not yours to keep." Oh my God, thinks Bobby. I gave it to my father for Christmas. I better get it back from him. Bobby tiptoes into his parents' bedroom. His father was snoring. He didn't even look ill anymore. His father's head is facing towards his mother, his neck facing towards Bobby. Bobby managed to untie the necklace, and it slipped off easily off his father's neck. He then gathers it together and discovers it's warm to the touch. Very warm. How odd, he thought. Bobby crept through the passage towards the front door of the cabin and opened it very gently. A cold wind whipped against his face. He shivered with cold as he stood there in the doorway, staring out into the dark. There was a mist that hovered above the snow, and the moonlight that danced through this foggy haze made everything glittery and ethereal, as if the mist itself was covered in a confetti of twinkling silver and gold glitter.
Everything about the night seemed outer-worldly and magical. He could swear he heard the tinkling of bells. And much like his vivid, explicit dream, the Bigfoot walked through a chiffon-like veil. He is staring at 3 of them close up. They're very intimidating, but Bobby is more in awe of them than fearful. There is something imposing and magisterial about these remarkable creatures, whose faces are so human and noble-looking, with intelligent eyes that are very discerning. When the large Bigfoot looked into Bobby's eyes, he held them for a long time. Bobby was certain the creature knew everything there was to know about him, as if he was reading his very soul, his heart, and even his life path. The Bigfoot spoke to Bobby in a strange language that was immediately downloaded into his mind in English, faster than any computer, which Bobby found extraordinary. I mean, how did that happen? These creatures had outer-worldly powers that we humans could only dream about. Imokolana agashagavanon igina golawana. Could you please give it to us? He said, stretching out his hand. Bobby reached out to give the Bigfoot the necklace. I'm really sorry. I didn't know it was yours. I'm sorry I took it. I gave it to my father for Christmas. The Bigfoot took the necklace from Bobby, holding it in his hands, and then he nodded. Omakila hushofana saka. Thank you for giving it back to us. The 3 Bigfoot nodded at him, and Bobby watched them disappearing into the mist, and then they were gone. See, I told you, said their mother the following morning. The teenagers tried to pull off that stunt last night by banging at the rafters, but we didn't bite the bait, did we? So they ran away. I guarantee they won't be back.
Has anyone seen the necklace Bobby gave me for Christmas? Asked Mr. Paxman. I seem to have misplaced it somewhere.
No, sweetheart, I haven't seen it, said Mrs. Paxman, but I'm sure you'll find it lying somewhere around. Maybe it fell off your neck. Bobby felt really bad about returning the necklace to the Bigfoot because he'd deprived his father of a Christmas present that his father had become clearly attached to. Still, there was nothing he could do about it. The necklace needed to be returned to its rightful owners, but Bobby wasn't going to tell his parents about everything that had transpired. But he was sure there was something magical about that necklace, as after his father had worn it, he had suddenly become well again. The next day something quite extraordinary happened. His mother said, "Oh, look, sweetheart, I found your necklace." It was on the patio, would you believe it?
"Oh, that is a relief," said Mr. Paxman. "I'm very attached to the necklace that Bobby gave me. The moment I wore it, I felt so much better, so I'm naturally very fond of it."
Bobby was amazed that there was a leather necklace in his mother's hands that did not remotely resemble the necklace that he'd given his father. There was just one amulet of a leaf carved out from bone and one eagle's feather, but it seemed that no member of his family appeared to realize it wasn't the same necklace, so Bobby didn't say anything. Had the Bigfoots managed to persuade his parents in their minds that it was the same necklace he'd given his father for Christmas? It would seem so. 1 week later, Mr. Paxman is sitting in the doctor's office, looking the picture of health. In 1 week he'd gained some healthy weight. His cheeks were no longer sunken, his eyes no longer hollow. The doctor scratches his head nonplussed.
"Mr. Paxman, I will be straight with you. I have no idea how it is remotely possible you have made such a marvellous swift recovery from a mysterious, enigmatic illness that almost certainly was killing you. I've seen some miraculous miracles in my time, believe me I have, but nothing that beats this. And your weight gain over the last week is simply extraordinary. You are without doubt a walking miracle, Mr. Paxman."
Even all these years later, my father still wears his lucky amulet around his neck. But I never told him that I believed something magical belonging to Bigfoots brought him back from the very brink of death. And whatever it was a Christmas miracle. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.